No. No, no, no. No, 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 don't do it! I thought we were having a nice date!
We are. Sit
Why
down.
does it matter? I thought we were having a nice
We are.
date!
We are.
Obsession and Backrooms are two of the biggest horror films of 2026. On the surface, they couldn't be more different. One is an intimate psychological nightmare. The other transforms an internet myth into a feature-length labyrinth of impossible spaces. But the more I think about each film, the more I realise that they are both tapping into something very similar. Horror has never simply been about monsters, ghosts, or slasher killers. It functions as society's subconscious, transforming our deepest anxieties into fiction. The giant monsters of the atomic age embodied fears of nuclear annihilation. The slashers of the 70s and 80s reflected anxieties surrounding the collapse of suburban security and the family unit. And after 9/11, horror became obsessed with torture, vulnerability, and the terrifying idea that unimaginable violence could erupt without warning. I could drone on about this and more forever and ever, but the point is that monsters are never just make-believe. They are usually reflections of something very real, and horror is scariest when it's tapping into something real, which is exactly what I believe Obsession and Backrooms do so well, because beneath their very different horrors, both films are really about the same thing: loneliness. Not simply physical isolation. Horror has always trapped people in haunted houses, underground tunnels, and endless forests or open roads. But today's horror is exploring something different. It asks what happens when you're surrounded by millions of people, yet struggle to form a meaningful connection with any of them. A fear that is all too real today. In 2023, the United States Surgeon General described loneliness as a public health epidemic, arguing that prolonged social isolation carries health risks comparable to smoking multiple cigarettes every day. Which is remarkable when you think about the world we've built. Never before have we had so many ways to communicate. We can text, phone, and video call. We can join online communities with people on the other side of the planet. We can watch the lives of thousands of strangers every second of every day. We can even spend many minutes listening to a random person on YouTube analyze horror films. Hello, by the way. Technology has undeniably made communication easier, but somewhere along the way, these new ways of communicating also began replacing the old ones. Lockdowns accelerated that shift dramatically. Office work, classroom learning, birthdays, and even dating moved online almost overnight. While restrictions eventually disappeared, many of those habits didn't. We returned to crowded cities, packed offices, and busy classrooms. Yet surveys consistently show that people feel more disconnected now than ever before. Loneliness is no longer defined simply by physical isolation. Increasingly, it's the feeling of being emotionally invisible while surrounded by other people. And perhaps nowhere is that more obvious than in everyday life. Restaurants ask us to scan QR codes instead of speaking to staff. Supermarkets replace cashiers with self-checkouts. Customer service is increasingly handled by chatbots. And many office jobs are now partially or fully remote. None of these changes are inherently bad. They're often faster and more convenient, but taken together, they've removed thousands of small moments of human interaction from daily life. And for the generation that grew up alongside these changes, the consequences appear particularly significant. Members of Gen Z are dating less, socializing less, and reporting higher levels of loneliness than previous generations at the same age. Psychologists have suggested that many missed or delayed opportunities to develop face-to-face social skills during formative years, a trend accelerated by smartphones, social media, and of course the pandemic, are to blame. Even the so-called Gen Z stare has become internet shorthand for a generation often perceived as less comfortable with spontaneous in-person interaction. When COVID first shut the world down, it seemed inevitable that horror would respond with films about viruses, lockdowns, and quarantines. Thankfully, audiences and even filmmakers seem pretty averse to such on-the-nose ideas. Instead, horror seems far more interested in tapping into what came after. If horror has always reflected the fears of its time, then it makes sense that today's monsters don't simply stalk abandoned houses or lurk in dark forests. They isolate us from one another. They imitate the people we love and the world we once knew. They offer artificial substitutes for genuine relationships and even the world itself. They exploit our desperate need to belong and our inability to connect. That's why I don't think it's a coincidence that Obsession and Backrooms have resonated so strongly in 2026. as beneath their very different surfaces, they're exploring the same fear. Not simply being lonely, but living in a world where genuine connection is slowly replaced by imitation. Obsession explores this concept rather directly, through an age-old idea. A young man makes a wish. The woman he desires falls obsessively in love with him, and everything spirals into a grotesque nightmare. But obsession isn't really that interested in magic, curses, or even romance. It's interested in loneliness, and just how dangerous the increasingly unhealthy ways we try to escape it can become. At the center of the story is Bear. He's awkward, withdrawn, and emotionally avoidant, but he isn't completely isolated. He has friends who seem to genuinely care about him. Ian, Sarah, and most importantly, Nikki. Crucially, Bear isn't the only person who struggles to communicate. Sarah can't admit at first how she feels about him. Nikki jokes that whenever she has a crush on someone, no one knows, and Ian avoids difficult conversations, leaving Bear to discover uncomfortable truths for himself. Everyone within this friendship group hides behind jokes, assumptions, and unfinished conversations. It's because of this I don't think that obsession is simply diagnosing one disturbed individual. Instead, it's doing something much harder. It's portraying an entire friendship group that has forgotten how to be emotionally vulnerable. In many ways, they're an uncomfortable stand-in for the worst habits of our generation, and Bear simply embodies those habits in their most destructive form, taken to their most extreme evils. It's because of this I don't think the label of incel horror works that well for obsession. I think using such an extreme term to label the film misses some of what makes it quite so unsettling. Whether or not someone like Bear would identify with such a label isn't something that I want to debate here. That's a discussion better left for the deepest, darkest corners of Reddit. But I don't believe that Bear is frightening because he's incapable of forming relationships with women. If anything, the film suggests the opposite. Sure, he's awkward and emotionally withdrawn, but he isn't an outcast, and Nikki seems to genuinely like him. In the opening scene, as Bear awkwardly rehearses confessing his feelings, it's clear that his attraction isn't built on simple lust. He remembers that Nikki was kind to him when he first moved to town and that she was the person who called after his nana died. Those moments of genuine compassion could have become the foundations of a real relationship. But instead, Bear transforms them into the foundation of a fantasy. Nikki described him as a closed book, and the film repeatedly shows us that this is true. When his cat dies, he can't bring himself to tell Nikki what has happened. Instead, he sits alone, scrolling through her Instagram. It's an incredibly revealing moment. Rather than turning to the real Nikki, he settles for a carefully curated version of her life, treating photographs as though they might somehow substitute for intimacy. It's a behavior that feels uncomfortably familiar. Digital technology allows us to feel connected to people while avoiding the uncertainty and vulnerability that real relationships demand, and Bear embodies that contradiction perfectly. We usually associate parasocial relationships with celebrities, but social media has blurred those boundaries. Friends, acquaintances, strangers, celebrities, and influencers now occupy the same endless feed, and we can convince ourselves that we know someone simply because we've consumed enough of their online life. And that's exactly what has happened to Nikki in Bear's eyes. He isn't really in love with her. He's in love with the version of her that he's assembled from idealized memories and social media posts. She's gradually stopped being a person and instead has become a solution to his loneliness, the missing piece that he believes will finally make him whole. And it's an illusion that's encouraged to all of us by the digital age. Dating apps and social media force us to imagine people long before we truly know them. And while this can be harmless, it can also turn quickly dangerous. From the film's opening moments, it's clear that Bear's understanding of love has already begun to drift away from reality. In his opening monologue, he insists that Nikki is in every song, and that he would choose her over everything. Pop culture has taught us to hear declarations like this as deeply romantic, but obsession reveals how unsettling they become when they're directed at an ideal. The film signals this misunderstanding long before the horror begins. When Nikki explains that she's writing a love story, Bear casually asks, "Isn't that the same thing as a romance?" At first, it feels like throwaway dialogue, but by the end, it becomes the film's central question. For Bear, romance means certainty, destiny, and grand declarations. Love, by contrast, demands mutual vulnerability, compromise, and the willingness to hear no. These misunderstandings of both Nikki and the concept of love transform Bear's feelings from something that could have become the foundation of a genuine relationship into something far more dangerous. It's through this that the One Wish Willow becomes such an effective tool of horror. At first glance, it appears to be just another monkey's paw, a cursed object destined to twist every wish into a cruel punishment. But seemingly, the willow isn't cursed at all. Instead, it simply grants exactly what people ask for. The crystal shop owners both admit that they've made wishes themselves, and neither appears traumatized by the experience. In fact, when Bear tells one of them, "This girl is obsessed with me," he simply replies, "What's so wrong with that?" It's an easy line to laugh at, but it's also an incredibly revealing one. He doesn't recognize obsession as horrifying because, like Bear, and perhaps some of the audience, he too mistakes it for love. But the moment that truly confirms the willow's function comes in one of my favourite scenes. When I first saw Obsession, I was sure I knew what was about to happen. As Ian made his wish for $1 billion and money fell from the sky, I was anticipating a comical, gory death. But there is no supernatural trick. Ian is not crushed to death by a pile of bills, and this changes the film in a really significant way. The One Wish Willow does not cruelly corrupt Bear's wish. It simply exposes him and the flawed understanding of love he possesses. Now, the act of making the wish itself is not evil. Bear doesn't genuinely expect the willow to work. The cruelty that goes on to define the wish is actually seen in what comes before. In Bear's refusal to confess how he feels even when Nikki outright asks. He makes the flippant wish because in his mind, magically winning her love feels no more impossible than honestly confessing his feelings. One path requires uncertainty and emotional risk. The other requires nothing except retreating further into fantasy. Rather than risking rejection, he wishes to bypass everything that makes love difficult, everything that makes it real. He doesn't wish for the confidence to tell Nikki how he feels. He wishes for Nikki to love him more than anyone else in the world. It's a subtle but crucial distinction. Love cannot be conjured into existence. It has to be built, freely chosen by two people. Bear wants all of the certainty without any of the vulnerability. But Bear does not understand this, as Bear does not really love Nikki. He loves an idea of her. His love, in a way, is just as manufactured as what the wish forces of her. Which is why, when the wish does come true, he doesn't behave like someone who really loves the real Nikki. At first, Bear remains largely unaware of what he's done. Assuming Nikki is drunk or high, he sleeps on the floor while she takes his bed. He gives in to her insistence that they share the bed, but at this point, the film still allows us to believe that he's simply confused. But gradually, as the truth is revealed, he refuses to do the right thing when various opportunities arise. The restaurant scene marks his point of no return. He knows something is deeply wrong with Nikki, yet the film cuts to them having sex. Nikki appears glazed over and emotionally absent, but Bear continues regardless. It's the moment Obsession reveals that the true horror isn't the wish itself, but it's Bear's willingness to exploit it. Afterwards, more revelatory moments pile up, until Bear is forced to admit that the wish has somehow worked. Desperate, Bear phones the helpline on the One Wish Willow's box and asks if his wish can be altered. The operator tells him it can't, but offers something else. Would he like to cancel it instead? Yet even after hearing the real Nikki's agonizing cries over the phone, Bear refuses, and the operator leaves him with one final piece of advice. Just because you made it happen doesn't mean it isn't real. Sounds to me like you have a moral obligation to be there for her. And Bear proves himself incapable even of that. The real Nikki breaks through Wish Nikki multiple times. At first screaming, then attempting to get the message to Bear via her fictional writing and labeled Polaroids until she outright begs him to kill her. To this, he simply asks, "What's so wrong about being with me?" To which she replies, "I've never been with you." At this, Bear simply walks away. He won't cancel the wish, he won't grant Nikki's request. He refuses to make any decision that forces him to confront the consequences of what he's done. The awkward, desperate man we met at the beginning is revealed to be something far uglier. An entitled coward willing to preserve his fantasy at the expense of another person's autonomy. Despite Bear being the film's true villain, Wish Nikki is where most of its horror resides. She isn't merely a supernatural doppelganger. She's the physical manifestation of imitation replacing authenticity. She tells Bear exactly what he wants to hear, but nothing she does feels genuinely human. The philosopher Jean Baudrillard argued that modern society increasingly replaces reality with simulations, copies that eventually become more meaningful than the originals they imitate. Whether or not you go quite that far, it's difficult not to see something similar happening here. Wish Nikki doesn't simply pretend to be Nikki. She becomes Bear's preferred version of her. Someone who never rejects him, never argues, and never possesses desires independent of his own. Built from idealized memories, Instagram scrolls, and fantasies, she resembles a human being assembled from fragments rather than genuine understanding. The closest contemporary comparison is generative AI. It can access information, mimic patterns, and reproduce familiar behaviors, but it fundamentally lacks the emotional understanding that gives human interaction meaning. The infamous sandwich scene captures this perfectly. Wish Nikki knows that Bear loved his cat, and she knows that he loves food and dreams of becoming a food critic. Working only with disconnected pieces of information, she concludes that combining the two into a dead cat sandwich would represent the ultimate act of love. And the same logic governs every unsettling behavior she does. Taping the door shut so nobody can separate them, standing motionless for hours, watching Bear sleep, and even soiling herself while waiting in the same spot for him. Every action is an exaggerated imitation of behaviors that might genuinely emerge from love or, of course, obsession. Like a waxwork sitting deep within the uncanny valley, she's just close enough to humanity that every difference becomes profoundly disturbing. Yet even in the film's closing moments, Bear still tries to preserve the imitation over reality. Faced with the consequences of his actions, he attempts suicide, only to panic and desperately force himself to vomit the pills back up. But before this, something significant has happened. For perhaps the first time in the film, Bear has reached out to his friends. It's the kind of vulnerable act that he had avoided from the very beginning, and tragically it comes far too late. Rather than saving anyone, his final attempt at connection only draws them both into the nightmare, ultimately leading to both Ian and Sarah's deaths. In the final scene, Wish Nikki wishes for Bear's love, but his suicide attempt has been made. Distracted by said wish, the pills have time to work, and his attempt succeeds, leaving us with a final haunting image of real Nikki returned, surrounded by the corpses of her three best friends. In Bear's desperation to escape loneliness, he chose imitation over the real thing, and in doing so, he became a monster. That is precisely the trap obsession identifies. The more we retreat behind screens and avoid the vulnerability genuine relationships demand, the more tempting artificial substitutes can become, and the less regard we can give for the real human that they are substituting. Bear is repeatedly given opportunities to stop. He can confess his feelings honestly. Later, he can cancel the wish, or end Nikki's suffering. But at every stage, he chooses not to. His loneliness may explain him, but it never excuses him. This kind of fear is of course nothing new. Horror has long understood that loneliness can curdle into obsession. 2002's May remains one of the genre's most heartbreaking examples, following a painfully isolated young woman who becomes so incapable of connecting with imperfect people that she attempts to build the perfect companion from stolen body parts. Audition similarly sees a grieving widower engineer a fake casting call in the hope of finding his ideal partner, while the loved ones transforms unrequited affection into violent possession. More recently, Companion asks what remains of love once consent and agency can simply be programmed away. Obsession belongs firmly within this tradition, but what makes it feel so distinctive isn't the fear itself. It's the world that it places that fear within. Bear doesn't misunderstand love simply because he's lonely. He belongs to a generation raised on social media, dating apps, and carefully curated online identities, where it's easier than ever to imagine a person long before truly knowing them. Obsession doesn't reinvent the horror of loneliness. It updates it for a generation increasingly attempted by imitation over vulnerability. Bear begins from recognizable impulses. Many of us have imagined people before we've truly known them, mistaken attention for intimacy, or look for shortcuts through loneliness. But where the film refuses sympathy is in what follows. Bear is given countless opportunities to stop. Instead, he repeatedly chooses fantasy over reality, possession over love, uncertainty over another person's autonomy. That is what makes him monstrous. Obsession simply asks what happens when those ordinary impulses are left completely unchecked, when an imitation matters more than another human being. But loneliness doesn't always manifest as obsession. Where obsession externalizes loneliness through relationships, Backrooms externalizes it through space. If Bear's nightmare is choosing a substitute for human connection, and in doing so neglecting the real thing, Backrooms imagines a world where human connection can disappear altogether. Born online, Backrooms is in many ways the ultimate internet horror. Over the last few decades, the internet has evolved into a storytelling medium in its own right, creating entirely new forms of horror that could never have existed anywhere else. Early creepypastas functioned like modern folklore, anonymously passed between users and constantly rewritten as they spread. From those foundations emerged analog horror, replacing traditional jump scares with degraded VHS tapes, distorted audio, and fragments of forgotten media that asked viewers to piece the story together for themselves. And running alongside this was another online fascination: liminal spaces. Psychologists use the word liminal to describe a threshold between one state and another. Online, however, the term evolved to refer to images of usually familiar spaces, unnervingly devoid of people or spatial logic. Empty shopping centres after closing time, school corridors during the holidays, hotel hallways, airport terminals late at night. They're unsettling because they're designed for human life, yet appear abandoned by it. They feel familiar, sometimes even nostalgic, but they unsettle our brains by being just slightly off. The timing proved almost uncanny. Just as liminal space photography exploded across the internet, the pandemic transformed much of the real world into exactly these kinds of places. Airports stood empty, offices echoed with silence, universities and shopping centres became vast shells waiting for life to return. For a brief moment, everyday reality resembled the internet's strangest images. In retrospect, it's hardly surprising that online horror became fascinated with spaces defined not by monsters, but by the absence of people. The image that came to define that fascination appeared on 4chan in 2019, a drab office-like room with stained yellow wallpaper and fluorescent lighting. Beneath it, an anonymous user wrote, "If you're not careful and you no clip out of reality in the wrong areas, you'll end up in the back rooms." With this sentence, an entirely mundane photograph became a collective mythology, and the backrooms were born. One creator who recognized the cinematic potential of that mythology was Kane Parsons. His YouTube series preserved the ambiguity of the original image while combining it with the fragmented storytelling and degraded aesthetic of analog horror. Rather than explaining the backrooms, Parsons trusted viewers to piece the world together through implication and atmosphere. The series attracted millions of viewers and eventually led to A24 adapting it into a feature-length film with Parsons himself directing. Yet, despite its larger scale, the film never loses sight of the idea that made the original image so compelling. The backrooms aren't frightening because they're full of monsters. They're frightening because they're full of spaces that were built for people but have somehow been emptied of humanity. The film follows Clark, a furniture salesman whose life has quietly fallen apart. His business is failing, his marriage has collapsed, and he spends his days selling carefully staged versions of domestic happiness that he can no longer experience himself. Surrounded by idealized homes, Clark has never felt further from having one of his own. At the encouragement of his therapist, Mary, who reluctantly begins confronting years of unresolved grief. But before he can truly do that, he discovers an impossible doorway hidden beneath his failing furniture showroom. That location is far more significant than it first appears. The furniture showroom is already a strange, kind of liminal space. Every room imitates domestic life, yet none of it is real. Kitchens where nobody cooks, dining tables where nobody eats, living rooms where nobody relaxes. It's an entire building devoted to selling the idea of a home rather than the home itself. Yet, before Clark even enters the backrooms, the film quietly reveals that he has begun sleeping inside one of those display bedrooms, surrounded by furniture pretending to be a life he no longer has. It's one of the film's most devastating images. Long before anything supernatural occurs, Clark has already retreated into an imitation of the world he longs to return to. He's sleeping inside a substitute for the home he lost, comforting himself with a version of domestic life that can never offer the connection he actually misses. With this, the backrooms feel less like an entirely new world and more like a continuation of the one Clark is already living in. That familiarity is precisely what makes them quite so unsettling. Liminal spaces disturb us because they feel recognizable, and Parson extends that logic to Clark himself. The backrooms are devoid of people, and stripped of the rhythms that once gave those spaces meaning. But Clark's life already resembles some of that emptiness. His furniture showroom sits on the brink of closure, and the home that he built his identity around no longer exists. Long before he crosses into the labyrinth, he is already living inside a kind of liminal space. In that sense, the Backrooms don't simply transport Clark somewhere impossible. They externalize the emotional landscape he already inhabits. His loneliness doesn't create the labyrinth, but it makes him feel as though he already belongs there. That idea feels increasingly relevant beyond the film itself. The shared spaces where strangers once naturally cross paths, our third spaces are quietly disappearing. As those places disappear, so too do many of the everyday opportunities for accidental human connection that they once provided. The Backrooms imagine the terrifying endpoint of that trajectory, a world where the buildings remain exactly as they were, but the people who once gave them meaning have vanished. What remains is a poor imitation of society with none of the humanity left inside. The endless nature of the Backrooms also evokes one of the defining experiences of modern loneliness: the algorithmic feed. As Clark wanders through room after room, he continually believes that the next corridor might finally contain an exit or an answer. It's exactly the same psychological loop that keeps us scrolling online. Every swipe promises that fulfillment lies one post further down. Every algorithm hints that meaning is only one more click away. Yet the feed never ends because it was never designed to. The Backrooms almost begin to resemble doom scrolling within their architecture. Like the digital world that increasingly mediates our lives, the Backrooms constantly promise discovery, connection, and escape while endlessly deferring them. Clark isn't simply trapped inside an impossible building. He's trapped inside a system that replaces fulfillment with the hope of fulfillment, leaving him to wander through an endless imitation of a world that can never truly feel alive. For much of the film, the Backrooms appear to exist for one simple purpose: to keep people wondering forever. But gradually, the film reveals something far more unsettling. The Backrooms aren't simply a prison. They respond to the people trapped within. Earlier generations imagined becoming lost in nature. Fairy tales stranded their characters in forests. Greek mythology trapped victims inside the Minotaur's labyrinth. Cosmic horror confronted humanity with a universe so vast that we become lost and insignificant within it. Backrooms inherits that ancient fear of endless wandering, but relocates it somewhere much more intimate. The labyrinth stops behaving like a physical place, and instead begins behaving like memory itself. It pieces together stolen moments from its victims' lives, reconstructing spaces that feel deeply familiar but never quite authentic. That transformation reveals the true horror of the Backrooms. Like the furniture showroom at the beginning of the film, these aren't just random places, but imitations of real ones. When Mary enters the Backrooms searching for Clark, the rooms begin to change. Endless fluorescent offices slowly give way to fragments of childhood homes, familiar hallways and half-forgotten memories. Her journey ceases to be a rescue mission and instead becomes a confrontation with the parts of herself that she has spent years trying to leave behind. By the film's final act, she's no longer just navigating Clark's nightmare, she's walking through her own. In the Backrooms, instead of losing ourselves in the unfamiliar, we lose ourselves inside ourselves. It's an unsettling idea because it feels so familiar. Loneliness has a way of trapping us in the past. We replay happier moments, revisit old photographs, and return to the places that once made us feel safe, hoping to recover something that no longer exists. The Backrooms literalize that instinct. They don't simply imitate physical spaces. They reconstruct memories, piecing together homes and corridors that feel intimately familiar, while stripping away the reality that once gave those places meaning. Like the furniture showroom, they reproduce the appearance of belonging without ever being able to recreate the human connection that made it real. Every room becomes a reminder that no imitation, however convincing, can replace what has been lost. And that idea reaches its horrifying conclusion during the film's uncanny family dinner scene. Mary awakens deep within the labyrinth, strapped to a chair, confronted by Clark, who has now embraced the Backrooms entirely. Gathered around the table are grotesque imitations of people. Their faces sit deep within the uncanny valley, recognizable enough to feel familiar, yet wrong enough to be deeply unsettling. One bears an unmistakable resemblance to Clark's ex-wife. Their approximations assembled from stolen memory. Even the meal itself reveals how fundamentally the Backrooms misunderstand the rituals they're recreating. Rather than serving food, Clark tears furniture stuffing from the stomach of one of those imitation people. The Backrooms clearly understand that families gather around dinner tables, and they understand that food belongs at the center of that ritual. But like generative AI, they can only reproduce pattern, never meaning. It's the same unsettling logic that defined Wish Nikki. Within this counterfeit world, Clark finally does what Mary has spent the entire film urging him to do. He talks. Yet he can only become emotionally vulnerable once every genuine human risk has been removed. After scalping the woman who resembles his ex-wife and placing her hair onto Mary, he finally begins the conversation he's avoided for years. But even this confession is carefully controlled. When Mary asks how she can help, Clark doesn't seek understanding or forgiveness. He asks only to be told that he did nothing wrong, that she was mistaken about him all along. Therapy, a process built on honesty and uncomfortable self-reflection, is transformed into another imitation. Clark wants all the reassurance of being understood without any possibility of challenge, disagreement, or rejection. Remind us of anyone? By this point, Clark has begun to resemble the Backrooms themselves. When he casually reveals the severed head of his assistant manager Kat, he barely acknowledges her death before moving on. Other people no longer exist to him as people. Like the labyrinth surrounding him, he has reduced them to props in a reality constructed entirely around himself. Yet the fantasy cannot sustain itself forever. The appearance of Pirate Clark feels less like the arrival of a monster than the return of everything Clark has spent the film trying to suppress. No matter how convincing the imitation becomes, reality eventually forces its way back in. The life Clark wanted has already been lost, and no counterfeit family, no reconstructed therapy session, and no artificial home can ever truly replace it. Clark begins the film sleeping inside a furniture showroom, surrounded by an imitation of domestic life. By the end, he has simply found a larger showroom, one populated not by display living rooms and empty bedrooms, but by imitation families, imitation therapy, imitation love, and imitation humanity. The Backrooms haven't changed Clark. They've merely given permanent architectural form to the substitute life that he'd already begun living. And in that moment, the film's central idea becomes unmistakable. Loneliness isn't simply dangerous because it leaves us alone. It's dangerous because it makes substitutes feel increasingly acceptable. Backrooms argues that no imitation of a home, a family, a memory, or another person can ever replace the messy unpredictability of genuine human connection. Like Obsession, Backrooms isn't ultimately afraid of isolation itself. It's afraid of the moment that we begin believing that an imitation might be enough. Backrooms is far from the only horror to explore these ideas through architecture. Another recent film, Skinamarink, similarly transforms the family home into an emotional landscape, trapping its young protagonists inside a house where familiar rooms no longer obey the rules of reality. And likewise, Mark Z. Danielewski's book House of Leaves imagines a home whose impossible shifting corridors reflect the emotional turmoil of the family trapped within. Across all these works, architecture ceases to be a passive setting and instead becomes a manifestation of loneliness, grief, and perception. The buildings themselves don't simply contain the horror. They become physical expressions of the inner lives of the people trapped inside them. This is ultimately what makes Backrooms feel like such a perfect companion piece to Obsession. One explores that temptation through relationship and the other explores it through architecture. Yet both arrive at exactly the same unsettling conclusion. Obsession asks what happens when the uncertainty of love is replaced by an imagined ideal, until another person's autonomy matters less than preserving the fantasy itself. Backrooms asks what happens when loneliness makes even the most grotesque imitation of home, family, and belonging feel preferable to facing reality. In both films, genuine human connection is gradually replaced by something easier to control, but impossible to truly inhabit. They begin in very different places, but they both arrive at the same question. What happens when imitation begins to feel easier than reality? Perhaps that's why these films are resonating so much in this particular moment. Never before have we possessed so many ways to communicate. We carry the lives of thousands of people in our pockets. We ask algorithms what to watch, where to eat, and who to date. We can generate conversations with artificial intelligence, scroll endlessly through carefully curated versions of other people's lives, and spend entire evenings inhabiting digital worlds without ever leaving our homes. None of these things are inherently frightening. Technology itself isn't the villain. What these films question is what happens when these conveniences slowly begin replacing the uncertainty that genuine human connection demands. When watching becomes easier than participating. When scrolling becomes easier than speaking. When performance becomes easier than vulnerability. When imitation becomes easier than intimacy. Obsession and Backrooms simply exaggerate habits that already exist. Bear chooses fantasy over another person's autonomy. Clark retreats into a world built from memories, rather than confronting the life beyond them. Both ultimately discover the same truth. An imitation can reproduce the appearance of connection, but never the real thing itself. If every era gets the horror films it needs, then perhaps the defining horror of the 2020s isn't being alone. It's slowly forgetting how to be together. Thank you so much for watching. Obviously, this is just one reading of both films, and there's a lot more that can be said. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on both Obsession and Backrooms in the comments below. And be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed the video and check out some of my other videos while you're here too. Thank you so much.